Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, JNUC 2020. It's a pleasure to be presenting today. I'm going to be covering Eli Lilly's journey over to Jamf and how we did our mass iOS migration. I'm just going to pause here for a brief moment to allow you to review our forward-looking statement. It'll also be available for a detailed review in the resources section on this page. So yeah, again, welcome to the presentation. Just quickly introducing myself. I'm Alex Toon. I'm a mobility engineer over on the Eli Lilly team, working globally now with Jamf. And I was one of the lead engineers on how we actually migrated over from our previous tool over to Jamf. So really looking forward to doing this presentation. So the agenda for this next 25 to 30 minutes is first up our purpose, followed by why we did this, then how we actually pulled off this mass iOS migration, then the outcomes, both for the user and for the enterprise, and then we should have about 5 minutes of Q&A. I will be in the comment section of this presentation throughout this whole thing, so please fire questions my way, but there will be a bit of dedicated time for everyone to rapid fire questions. And yeah, I'll try to get around to as many as I possibly can during the session. Thank you. So first up, Eli Lilly's purpose. Who are we? What are we about? Well, Lilly actually creates medicine to make life better all around the world. We are a global pharmaceutical company specializing in many different disease areas. But for the context of this presentation, what you need to know is that we're pretty sizable. We've got people in over 100 countries in the world speaking all sorts of different languages and cultures. That was definitely an interesting challenge to navigate around during this mass iOS migration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout. So it'd be naive of me to think of iOS in its own little bubble. When we first started off in this journey, we have to look at what I said, the state of the union across the board on our team, not just in terms of mobility, but in the Mac space and also the Windows space. One thing I want to point out here is that each one of these different spaces actually had its own MDM or UEM, depending on the acronym you want to use. And then following on from this, each one of those different MDMs has its own set of integrations, both internally with ways of doing authentication and so on, and then also externally, depending on what other resources and other things that we need to hook into. This is key here because what I'm talking about in this presentation is the journey and why we decided to do what we did. And in this slide, you can see that one of the key objectives was actually to merge the MDM tooling on the iOS side over with the Mac side. So then we actually had, along this journey, the ability to leverage what they have already built inside of their team, which is, mostly the most common kind of integrations that most organizations would have. They already had it set up inside of Lilly, so we could borrow that side, accelerating the whole journey, but then getting a lot of synergies between the teams, which I'm going to talk a lot more about later. It's this kind of point that was super critical in why we went this direction we did, and then also how we pulled it off in the time span that we did. So we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So moving on to the criteria of the overall Jamf migration, but remaining strongly in the why. On the last slide, we talked about merging those MDMs together, going from the mobility space and then starting to leverage what the Mac team had, which is obviously Jamf. Let's talk about the other criteria that's important. So first up, and I referenced this before, was that internal technology. There's a lot of different integrations there that we absolutely had to connect with. Anything from identity, authorization, to security, so on. There's a long list there. But then also with external technologies, right? All sorts of different connections that we either need to pull from or push to, depending on what the need is. And we absolutely had to make sure that Jamf was capable of providing that, but not just for the Mac space, but then, allowing the mobility side, the iOS side to move over and still provide everything that we needed to do to, have a stable service up front, but then also for our long-term objectives, being able to grow towards that. Another really key point was the user experience. So not just the user experience of the migration, but what's the user experience once the user is actually in Jamf? Everything from how quickly your applications come down, web clips, what's the store experience like, and so on. What is that overall package like? What is it like when we first move over, and then ultimately, where can we grow to make that even more and more refined, depending on the capabilities, right? And Jamf stood out really strongly to us in this space after a whole round of testing, and was definitely key criteria to why we made this move. Moving on as well, security, a huge factor. Jamf is absolutely fine, in our opinion, in that space, and ticked all the boxes. And then kind of finally on the key criteria piece is that migration, the main objective of this presentation. But absolutely, like, how does that look like? What's the journey like? What's the timescales like? All of that kind of good stuff, which is the most of the content in the rest of this presentation, which we'll talk to. But then I don't want to forget some of the wider considerations that we had. These were definitely secondary, but we didn't want to forget them, such as costs. Not everyone can just ignore how much things cost in the world. That is obviously a factor. It played, I would like to argue, a minor role in the overall discussion, but it's still obviously a part to play. And then there was also several other what we just call team-wide considerations that we absolutely had to make sure that Jamf could do, but still secondary to the other key criteria points highlighted. So the why, and then starting to blend into the how we did this. Let's talk about the migration paths. So why did we pick the certain migration path that we did? Well, when we first started out, we really thought of three main ways of doing this. We have our big bang approach, then passive, and force re-register. So let me just explain what they are and give you a few pros and cons. So first up, number one, the big bang approach. So what does this mean? So we actually investigated several different ways of doing what we call back-end database migrations. So in this kind of scenario, the user would have minimal input in doing the migration. It's really all back-end engineering stuff. This would provide a huge reduction in lead time. It would provide all sorts of pretty cool benefits. However, there's quite a long list of cons that come with this. There is a point of no return, which naturally makes it very high risk. What we mean by this is once we actually do that database migration swap, we can absolutely no longer go back to the previous MDM. Again, very high risk, considering this is the first time at scale we're now going to Jamf in Lilly. Second to that, which is a huge loss, is the loss of the DEP flag, which allows us to gain supervision, which is key in iOS 13, definitely key in iOS 14, and we know the trend is going that way. So we absolutely need to make sure that supervision is key in gaining somehow through this migration and just leveraging this opportunity to get that. And then also it's just the fact that this overall approach was really just an industry first. We at the time, and probably still do, we didn't feel comfortable being the first through the breach with a company of our size and our risk, especially with that point of no return. If things went poorly, somehow, some way, this could have honestly just blew up in our face. So at the time, we didn't feel comfortable approaching that way. So number two, let's talk about passive migration. So this is really simple. It's basically just leveraging a natural LCM process. So let's say an iPhone or an iPad within your company lasts maybe 2, 3, or 4 years. Well, the way we're kind of thinking about this approach is if we could simply just wait, and then any new device naturally goes over to Jamf, and then we just simply wait for all devices on mobile line to just life cycle off, and once it gets down to a small number, then push people to manually move over themselves. This has a lot of pros to it. The users don't have to do much. There's no disruption to any real service. The biggest downside, though, is a huge amount of time. Something like this, again, going on how long people use a device or between wipes, again, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 years, just lead time of handling that migration, which for that alone, we completely disregarded a passive LCM kind of migration from where we were before over to Jamf. So number three, let's talk about force re-register. So what does this mean in all reality? So this is a case where we send out a bunch of communication, we retire users or we get them to self-retire, and then we give them guides or instructions on how to do their own re-enroll manually over in Jamf. This has a couple of cons to it. It's quite distracting and disrupting for users. However, the lead time is definitely shrunk quite dramatically when you definitely compare it to something like the passive migration. This also gives us two other benefits too. It's proven. We know we have solid instructions from Jamf, and that we can produce these in a way that is definitely very solid, very known. And then also it gives us the added benefit of getting supervision for those who don't have it today but are possibly in Apple Business Manager. This would be absolutely huge based on what I said earlier. Really is a key objective to gain more and more of a supervision percentage, and leveraging this big migration is just a key natural point in enabling that journey. So to that end, we actually focused in on a forced re-register process. The biggest con here being the user disruption that I was talking about. So at this point, all our energy really went into how can we actually lessen that impact as much as possible. And then that's how we get into how we actually pulled this journey off. So moving on to the how, and let me introduce an application that we coined as iMove. So iMove was a native application that we built to help people along this journey. So what it did is it figured out which state the device is in, and I'll get into that in just a second. Provide the relevant instructions to the user and the relevant guidance, and then progress them through that journey. So it's at this point where really the journeys fall into two main paths, path 1 and path 2. Path 1 being what we call an in-place migration. This doesn't require a device wipe at all. It provides the ability to keep personal data on the device throughout this migration. The downside is this was only available to supervised devices, going back to my last point. Remember that to gain supervision can only be done on device activation after a device resets. So for those who are unsupervised, this path was not eligible for them, with the exception of a few different cases that I'll get into on the next slide. Overall, the migration of path 1 could take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And then throughout our journey, we did have a couple of issues that I'll go into in just a minute. However, I'll also talk about how we mitigated those and worked around it. Moving on to path 2, this is obviously only for unsupervised devices. All the device data is wiped at this stage. It has to be device reset based on what I just said. But also one of the main kickers here was that we couldn't also allow anyone to use their backups, even in the iCloud. The reason for this is that when you use an iCloud restore, that actually takes precedent over any instructions that it receives from ABM. So even though in ABM that serial number might be pointing to Jamf, if you try to use an iCloud backup from a previous MDM, that will actually then take hold and it will try to use those instructions once again, not actually migrating the device anywhere. So unfortunately for the users who went down this path, it was a complete device reset, losing all data, corporate and personal on the device, and also not having the ability to use a restore, which is obviously massively disruptive. By the time we felt that it was very important to gain supervision and also move people over to Jamf in a very timely manner. With this as well, the path was very known, very well documented, and also just the most straightforward amongst the whole experience, and you'll understand why in just a minute. So staying within the how, but specifically diving into path 1, which is arguably the most complicated for the user, but also was for us to pull off in the sense of the logic behind the iMove application. Let's just dig into that a little bit more. So let me tell you the user story there. So first off, the user will get a series of emails asking them to prepare for their migration. Then, followed by that, they'll get another email asking them to actually join the migration and that they need to go through this series of processes. The first thing they do is launch the application. At this point, the application will share with them, a little welcome message and a couple of instructions, as well as some optional information for those who are a little bit more concerned or just more curious about the Jamf migration. At that point, behind the scenes, the iMove app will actually do a check based on the plist or the app config on is the device already supervised. If the device is already supervised, at this point, we've got one of the biggest benefits we want, and we can actually just progress them straight onto the retire stage and then let them move on throughout path 1. If they're not supervised, we actually do another check, and this is getting into the detail. We actually check if this device is already in Apple Business Manager or not. The way we do this is actually hit the Jamf API and see if it's in the pre-stage enrollment. If it is in the pre-stage enrollment, in our default pre-stage enrollment, it means that this device is in Apple Business Manager. So if we wipe the device or did a factory reset, it will then gain supervision, which is absolutely what we want. If this is the case, it will then move on to actually path 2, which for a subset of our devices at least, this was kind of quite common. But if it's not an ABM and not supervised, then we actually progress them straight on to retire. The reason we do this is, again, if they're not an ABM, they're not, there's no point resetting the device because they will not gain supervision. So the biggest benefit of them doing a controlled wipe is not gained. So at this point, we actually made a decision that we will let these go through because there's quite a few different countries that still do not support ABM. So this could be quite common, and there was no added value in actually wiping their devices, which would include wiping their personal data and have a massive disruption both to their work life, but potentially to their personal life. So for this, we actually put a bit of logic in there that essentially let them off, and they could continue going down path 1, even though they're not supervised. This only really applied to a very small subset of our overall pool. Usually it was pretty clean cut, but we still wanted to build this in because otherwise it would be incredibly frustrating for the user. So let's say those devices do then retire. What's the rest of that process looking like? Well, at that point, it's pretty standard. They're retired from a previous MDM. At that point, they've only got their personal data on their device. At that point, we automatically send them to the Jamf enroll URL. They authenticate through the usual means, and then go through. Once they go through, they download the profile, and then they have to go into settings and actually accept that configuration profile, and then they're in Jamf. But let's talk about the configuration profile, because that's one piece that if anyone is going to follow along this journey, you absolutely need to stress. Most users are not familiar with installing configuration profiles and settings. Absolutely not. And this is one key point that we definitely discovered, and through our OCM, our communications and guides, instructions, and iMove, we, through earlier phases and piloting, we knew this was going to be a problem, so we did as much as we possibly could to prepare users for that, even including a short video inside of the iMove app that we forced people to watch for 20-30 seconds, just to make sure that they understood that this is something they need to do, and it's not just a case of downloading the profile from Jamf, they actually need to accept and install it too, which is very, very critical. So staying within the how still, let's talk a little bit more about that user experience. I know I painted a picture of what it looks like for path one, but I'm sure everyone was actually curious to what some of that material really looked like. So here you can see our little timeline again of people getting their get ready messages, followed by having the invitation to the migration. And here you can see an example of our communications we literally did send out, or the banners that we included in our emails. Followed by the iMove application. Again, in here, it reinforced absolutely everything that the user had to do, backing up their data, not through iCloud, but through other means like their photos, videos, contacts, and so on. All had to be, backed up in various places. Complete the migration steps. And then for those, unfortunately, who had to do a controlled wipe through path 2, they would have to set up their device almost all over again, including downloading all the personal applications and typing all the passwords, which again, we understood was going to be a big disruption, but was key for the overall objectives of the enterprise that we had to do. So following on from that, just another quick slide, you can see the user experience again. Pre-COVID, of course, when we could actually physically hand things out in offices globally, you can see some of the takeaway cards and email headers. Again, just in greater detail. Stay out of phone jail was actually quite effective. That did get people's attentions, both good and bad. And as long as we then leveraged that, which we did, to get people moving, it was definitely very effective. And people did find this reminder through various channels to be very useful. They were comforted, they knew this was something they had to do, they knew they were supported, and ultimately they knew where to go get help if required. That was definitely a key point that we had to push across to people. One more thing I would like to add, just to the overall user experience, is that once we actually had these materials almost nailed down through our pilots, all of it then required being translated in about 11 different languages for global use and global rollout, which did take quite a lot of effort and a lot of tweaking. But again, for a global organization such as Lilly, was critical to do. English is our main business language, but for many countries out there, it still had to be disseminated in their native language and culture, and get all the right messaging across in the right way. So a lot of effort did eventually go into translating those materials. It wasn't just a case of we could make a lot of stuff in the pilot, figure it out, and then we were done. It did take a lot of tweaking. You have to be quite agile with this approach, and especially with the communications. It wasn't just a case of making an application, we were done. The overall support, communications, everything had to be well thought through, and it was key to our success in moving our devices over. So moving on, so let's talk about the timeline. So when we tackled this was around early to mid-March, moving over to middle to late June of 2020. So throughout all this, we were also dealing mostly with COVID. There was a lot of stuff we did pre-COVID to prepare for this, and including a whole lot of different pilots that we ran, including those handout cards that we did. We did a lot of that January and February time. But then COVID happened, and a lot of things had to pivot. Our timeline, though, stood pretty true throughout. But let's just dive in from top to bottom. So the first natural thing that we did was any new device, regardless of where it came through, either through ABM or not through ABM, any new device globally immediately had to go to Jamf. So new devices, break fix, LCM, any of that stuff immediately had to go to Jamf. And with the size of Lilly, there was actually quite a few hundred devices a month, just constantly capturing that, throughout. Then talking about our biggest market, which is the United States of America, the reason they're singled out on this timeline is because they are simply the biggest affiliate within our organization. So throughout here, you can see how we actually did an additional pilot mid-April, just to nail down those materials and make sure that they was comfortable as a business unit to move forward. After that point, we split it into iPhones, iPads, for the field force, again, just targeting select individuals as best we could on their device type, giving them as much guidance as possible. But then also anyone who's a non-field device, at a certain point, we actually made a decision to include in our standard path right at the bottom. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Another thing to point out is across all the different global affiliates, they had their own natural dates that could have worked in our favor if we leveraged them properly, such as, beginning of the year kickoffs or different check-ins, different events, sales events, whatever the case is. We try to leverage as many as we possibly could globally, where people were in a certain location altogether at once, where then en masse, we could leverage that time altogether and physically help people move devices over. This was actually really key in our China affiliate, where in just a handful of days we actually migrated over thousands of iPads in just 1, 2, 3 days, which was absolutely fantastic, huge effort, but it was able to really maximize getting people over to Jamf as fast as possible. In fact, at that point, it was a case of getting up boards in a big conference room where people could physically have a device in hand and walk across the different boards for the different steps that they had. So again, just another example of where you need to leverage these certain dates and events to your advantage as much as possible, especially if your deadlines are tight. So lastly, about timelines, and I want to talk about our standard development path. So you'll actually see a line just above that talking about the material and application translation. And I know I mentioned that in the last slide, but it's worth mentioning again. So once we finished our pilots, in the March timeframe, that really nailed down the bulk of our materials, but they were only in English. So at that point, we had to use as much time as possible and as much energy as possible to get this translated in the language, in the culture, and everything that could be possibly applicable, and use regional points of contact, country points of contact, to try and do that as fast as we possibly could. And at that point, we really began with English devices first, but then very, very quickly after, then began with non-English devices all around the world. So right at the very bottom of this slide, you'll see one great item where it talks about shared and specialized devices. So this is mostly in a manufacturing space, but it's actually used in many, many different teams globally in Lilly. What we mean by this is really any device that has a special configuration profile applied to it. It could be anything from an iPad in kiosk mode at one of our help desks physically on site, versus where a manufacturing line worker needs to use a special application on just one device that they can share between their shifts. There's a lot of different devices globally that this applies to, and in the timeline presented here, we had to actually completely rebuild their configurations and test in Jamf, and then follow up with a migration afterwards. A lot of effort had to go in here, a lot of engineering time to make sure that we actually got that right and that we did all the right testing, but it was definitely key to the overall objective, even though compared to general devices, the device count was quite low. So for my last slide, I have to talk about outcomes. Did we hit the original objectives and the criteria that we sought out to? And the way I've broken it down here is for the user, which is very, very important, but then also for the enterprise. And then just a couple of final words on lessons learned. So for the user, what are the main benefits that we found moving over to Jamf? Well, the first thing was that we actually found that the deployment process was a lot smoother. I simply mean applications and web clips coming down to the device. The Jamf Cloud instance that we use is highly efficient, definitely pushing down those applications very, very quickly, which the user gives them a sense of security. They know they've done the right thing. It's not a case of an awkward pause just after deployment. They know they're in the right place because they're getting all their Lilly applications. Following on from that, the next big thing that we discovered when we did the testing, and that our users have been talking about, is the vastly improved self-service store. It's a lot quicker, it's a lot sharper, and gets users to exactly what they want, downloaded as fast as possible, and no messing about in between. This is definitely a huge win. And then for our Mac users that also have an iPad or an iPhone, they found a lot of common things between the two platforms, which immediately made them feel comfortable once they migrated that iPhone and iPad over. This was definitely a good win, and something that we want to build on top of, making sure that we've got parity across that State of the Union I was talking about. And then finally, I know I briefly mentioned this in the last slide, but the capabilities for shared and specialized devices are definitely superior over to Jamf. There's a couple of out-of-the-box features that we are looking to leverage right now, and definitely in the future, that Jamf can pull off, and allows to give ourselves a bit more flexibility and capability for certain advanced users and advanced use cases if and when we need to deploy. Also, just as an engineer who has to build most of these, working it in Jamf with the way that we've designed it is, much more streamlined. I don't need to spend a long time actually now building these configurations. Jamf has a lot of tooling inside that can really make that process quick and sharp, which is fantastic, and just reduces the amount of time and effort we need to put in place just to build a simple configuration. So then next up on the slide is talking about the enterprise. Well, the first thing we absolutely need to say, and the timing of JNUC is actually quite good with the recent announcement and release of iOS 14. Jamf and Apple have a really good partnership, a lot of zero-day functionality straight out the gate, which for a company of our size, with literally thousands of users who are very eager to leverage, the latest iOS versions, and we also do not want to stop them if we can help it. Immediately Jamf is ready for that challenge because of their partnership with Apple, and it pays dividends the entire way, and just gives us as much flexibility and as much capability as soon as possible, which is exactly one of the key features that we were looking for. Looking back as well at our criteria, the very first point that I made was just combining our MDMs together between the iOS and the Mac space. Let's talk about the outcomes of that. What do we actually gain? Well, behind the scenes, right, there's a lot of processes that we can immediately streamline between the two teams. We can share effort and share the burden of some of the things that we consider global that work for both Mac and for iOS. But then also allows us now over time to start having common alignment in even our support structure, the true personnel who are running our ship. We can get them to start talking together, cross-train, and provide support truly globally, 24/7, and just constantly being available with a multi skill set, which just naturally provides a lot of benefits and definitely gets people skilled up in just more than one discipline. And then the last point for the enterprise is obviously gaining supervision. This is very, very critical to our goals, and you can see with just iOS 13, 14, and definitely continuing, there's going to be a lot of restrictions within a configuration profile that will get grandfathered over time. So getting supervision now and being able to maintain that level as much as possible is going to be key, because again, there'll be restrictions in the future that are going to depend on supervision that Lilly absolutely needs. So putting in the effort now and leveraging this migration experience to almost pay it forward and get us into that key position is going to help us for many years to come, as and when Apple decide to grandfather certain restrictions or potentially even add more restrictions that require supervision. So my last point in this presentation is all around just the lessons learned. If you can take these 3 points on top of everything else that I've said, I really hope that it puts any of you who are planning on following a certain or the similar journey, it puts you in good stead. So first up, if you are going to build something similar to iMove or doing something the same way, I would strongly recommend that you make it a web application rather than a native application. The main reason for this is just removing the developer trust issue. For us, the majority of our users were able to get through quickly enough that they didn't actually run into this issue, but for quite a few of our users, if they weren't quickly enough, they decided to have that phone call, have a bite to eat, or anything like that while doing the migration, then they were very likely to run into the developer trust issue, which meant when they went to iMove, they would have that nasty little pop-up and then have to fall back on either the guide that we sent separately, or unfortunately, call the help desk and get support that way. Luckily at that point, really all they needed was the Jamf enroll URL to progress forwards, but even, let's say we had a 10% fail rate on path one for that still ends up being thousands of calls to the help desk over the period of the migration. So as much as you can lessen that or just avoid the problem altogether by building a web application, will definitely put you in good stead. Following on from that, I would also strongly recommend, and this one might seem obvious, to include testers outside of IT. Absolutely do this. We got a lot of feedback by the point where we then started testing this out in the field with our sales reps, or really anyone who's just non-IT. We got a lot of feedback, and that feedback is going to be absolutely crucial for your success. So do not just include people in IT because it's safe. You need to be quite aggressive with giving that feedback as early as possible, and just lowering the cost of change as much as you can. And again, just get that feedback from people other than IT. Last but not least, and this might only really apply to companies of quite a scale, but the way our help desk structure is set up is, US or Americas, Europe, and then Asia Pac. So the three main hubs of countries, right? For us, we actually didn't stagger within those regions. So let's take Europe for an example, having Germany go before the United Kingdom and then Spain and so on and so forth, right? And really stagger them out within a country. Otherwise, for us, if you do have any potential issues, even maybe a 1 or 2% fail rate, that could potentially mean hundreds of calls to the desk in a given day, which potentially can cripple them, right? So we would strongly suggest, depending on how your help desk structure is set up, to stagger within that. It sounds really simple, but kind of think of it like COVID, where you're trying to flatten the curve as much as possible. And it will dramatically help your help desk just cope with the influx. Because one thing that we found is that once someone called up the help desk, if they've been waiting a while, they are desperate not to hang up that phone and will keep that help desk agent for as long as possible because they know how much time it's taken to get onto the phone with them. That then has a knock-on effect, creating the queue to be even longer and then exacerbating the problem as much as possible. Flatten the curve and separate and stagger your countries within your help desk structure, and that will help dramatically. So I just want to say thank you for listening to this presentation. It's been good providing it, and I just want to remind everybody that I'm answering questions in the comments in the Q&A section right now for the next couple of minutes. But if I don't get around to your question, reach out by email or LinkedIn, and I'll do my best to reply. And good luck to those who decide to migrate maybe through one of the methods I've discussed today. Talk to you soon.